current events and how racism and inequalities not only impact but continue to shape our lives, our careers, and how many of you, even as students, operate on a day-to-day basis with you guys here. We have come to a pivotal moment in our history. Protests are continuing to take place around the country and around the world. And businesses have made public declarations in a way that they haven't had to before. Declarations of solidarity, pledging to take stronger roles in the call for equality, recognizing Juneteenth, for example, and even changing their corporate branding and imaging standards. Tonight, though, as Dr. May said, we're going to have a conversation of respect and learning. That's the goal for tonight's meeting. We want to illuminate some of these issues and their significance in our lives by bringing together a diverse group of people like yourselves who are able to offer different perspectives, each with some kind of tie to Reinhardt University. We want to talk about this moment in time and even some of the questions that these current events are forcing us to ask ourselves. There's a lot of things going on in society, and some of it may cause us to be more introspective about race, politics, inequality than we had to before. Tonight we have a great group. Joining us this evening are, and I pray I'm not going to mispronounce anyone's name, so I'm really trying hard, Dr. Frederick Tarrant.
Hello.
Good, thank you. Dean of the School of Performing Arts. Dr. Pamela Wilson.
Hi.
Hi. Professor of Communications and Media Studies. Dr. Catherine Meeks, Executive Director. Thank you for being here. Executive Director of the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing. Calvin Robertson, an alumni of Reinhardt University and former member of DREAMS. Adam Powell, a campus counselor at Reinhardt University.
Hello.
Randy Smith, an alumni of Reinhardt University. Judah Norman, a current student at Reinhardt University and acting president of DREAMS.
Hello.
And I am looking at Ian Schumacher. Are you also a member of the panel as well? Well, we're all together.
Not really. I can be. I'm a student, alumni, and staff member, kind of all at once at Reinhardt right now. I used to be in DREAMS as well.
Awesome. And I see also we're joined by Nicholas Johnson. Thank you for being here. So before I get started, I did want to point out, and I'm not sure if Dr. May made a note of it, that people, I know that we have people who registered for this discussion. They can also submit questions and comments via chat. And so I'm going to do my very best to make sure that I try to capture each one and make sure that people's questions are also answered, okay? But I wanted to start off with some of the students and alumni tonight because, you know, while I do believe that we stand on the shoulders of those who come before us, I staunchly believe that. I recognize that much of the protests and this continued momentum has been through young people. So I would like to speak to them first and ask them how they've dealt with their own feelings about the deaths of Mr. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and most recently here in Atlanta, Rayshard Brooks. So I'm going to ask all of the panelists to unmute themselves and just feel free to chime in. Brandy, would you like to give your thoughts? Brandy?
Sure. So I'm an alum. I graduated in 2001. You know, as I think about the deaths of those people and where we are in history, one thing that I have a challenge with is every day I also work with young people. So I'm a college counselor in a high school. And so I directly see the impact on a daily basis of how systematic racism works, how it directly affects kids, even in how I advise them about the college process. And so when I saw all of this happening, it sort of felt like a Mac 10 truck hit me, but then it also kind of felt like we've also been through this before, right? Like this is not something new. My school, we are currently in the midst of cultural fluency training. So it's like all of these things have coincided at the same time. So it's been really challenging to see how that sort of plays out. But I think, you know, I think as a Black person in this country, you do have to sort of, in some ways, compartmentalize who you are in both a professional and a personal setting. Because if you just sit and look at the news and look at what's happening, it will drive you to a point of insanity. And so I've tried as best as I can to be aware of what's going on, but I've had to also take breaks from social media. I also, in my profession, do a lot of work around helping marginalized students feel seen through the college admission process and a lot of social justice work. So it's not something I can completely like just put my head under the covers and not pay attention to. But I think I'm still processing, right? Like I think, you know, the fact that Breonna Taylor, like the police officers who shot her still haven't been reprimanded or fired, like that, it's just a lot. So just try to process as best as I can.
Have any of your students said that they participated in any of the protests at all?
Yeah, so actually both current students and former students, I actually had 4 former students who actually coordinated a protest near the Marietta Square, which actually brought 800 people there. And it was really interesting to see their journey through that process. 3 of the 4 were kids that in high school never talked about race, never talked about anything controversial in any way. But even just after being in college a year or a semester, it had made such a profound impact on them that they said, we can't just sit by and not do anything. And for many of them, they would say to me that they felt like some in a lot of ways, a lot of high schools don't prepare kids once they get to college to engage in difficult conversations. And so that was part of the reason I pushed our school to really think about cultural fluency training, because I do think, especially in public schools, there's not enough time in the school day around the social, emotional well-being of kids to know how to engage in difficult conversations. And then they're thrust onto college campuses and it's like first year seminar, like, let's talk about difficult stuff. And they're like, but that's great. But like, I haven't been given the tools to know how to do that. And so we're really trying to figure out ways that we can help our students to have difficult conversations. But before we can do that, we have to have difficult conversations. And I think we're kind of in that stuck position right now, because I think people want to be really courteous and you don't want to offend people. Those from Reinhardt know me, I generally don't have much of a filter. I'm also from LA. So I think, you know, I love Southern hospitality, but that is also not something that sort of organically comes out of me. So I have to sort of filter it sometimes. So I'm like, let's have a difficult conversation. And everyone's like, but do we have to? But we're getting there. So yeah.
A cultural shift. Judah, I'd like to also to hear from you. You're a current student also, right?
Yes, I am.
So what are your thoughts about, you know, the deaths of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud, and Reinhardt?
I will say that when I first heard about the incident via social media or via the news, I did throw a huge fit. I was in here screaming, I was crying. My mom had to put me to bed. I was just emotionally not stable at all, because I just have such an empathetic heart for people that when I just really think about the circumstances that surround these events, it does drive me insane. And my mom and I have both been newsaholics, because you try to turn off the news and then something else happens 2 seconds after you decide you're going to turn on the news, and you always have to stay informed. So how I have been trying to sort of manage everything is, even though I personally chose not to go to the protests because of COVID-19 and for other reasons, how can I, as a person, even just in my own physical realm of existence, how can I influence other people and protest in a different way? And one way is to find the petitions and the emails to send and to sign as well as calling the officials to get the officers charged and arrested and prosecuted and sentenced. And then also my mom and I have taken to social media to spread awareness and to spread information, because there are some people who really just don't know. One thing I've noticed about those who do not experience racism on a daily basis, like Black people, most of them don't even know. A friend of my mom, she was honest with her on a phone conversation after a post that my mom made. She said she went her whole life not even knowing what racism even is. She didn't even know what racism was until this whole event with George Floyd just exploded. She didn't even know about Ahmaud and Breonna before this. And I felt like I needed to be able to inform people in my circle about what is happening and the generational history behind it. So that's one way how I am learning to decompress a little bit from the news and from everything that's happening, but also protest as well in order to spread awareness and to make people aware of what is happening and aware of how they might be affecting the system, whether or not they intend for it to happen.
Right. Very good. Dr. Taryn, what are your thoughts there? You have a very pensive look on your face right now.
My thoughts are, I'm looking around, probably the oldest aging white male on this panel, in this Zoom meeting. I perhaps am the one who has benefited the most from the privilege, and it bothers me that I'm often unaware of the harm that takes place daily, hourly, and presumably harm that I have been part of that I'm not even aware of. And one of the reasons I want to be part of this is so that I can understand better, and not just see from my own perspective.
One of the things that, was there a comment from someone?
I'm sorry, Kanika.
Yes.
There's a couple of requests. Would you please speak up a little bit?
Okay, can you hear me better now?
That's better.
Okay, I guess I must speak for my diaphragm then. Okay.
Yes. Thank you, dear.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for that. One of the things that, Judah mentioned it, and I think you, Dr. Tarrant, kind of alluded to, is that one of the comments that people are saying is that there's so many different people who are involved in these protests, who are acknowledging the struggles of African Americans throughout the years, So what are your thoughts on that? That it's not just, what you see is not just one kind of face, it's not just one kind of culture. So what are your thoughts on that? Dr. Wilson?
Hi, I have so many things that come to mind. I guess I went to a Black Lives Matter rally in Cartersville Saturday, and it's one of the only times I've left my house during the COVID, but I felt it was so important to stand up for, not just to give lip service on social media to, which, I do a lot, but I felt like I needed to put my feet where my mouth was, or where my typing fingers are, I guess, and actually participate. And I live in Cartersville. It's a small community. This was the second Black Lives Matter or a reaction to George Floyd's death, of a gathering or a march. And I was just amazed at the fact that, I don't know, 90% of the people there were young, were teenagers and in their 20s. This was not a civil rights march of veteran civil rights marchers from the 60s and 70s. This is a whole new generation. And it really inspired me and gave me hope that the change that's happening is going to come from this younger generation, and that all the work that many of us have done, some of us longer than others, as Fred said, those of us who are white have taken longer to understand and come to terms with, and we're still trying to understand the daily experiences and discriminations of people of color, but to understand our own privilege. And so as a teacher, one of the things that I try to do is to have those difficult conversations in the classroom. And any of you who have taken particularly my intercultural communication class, you know, it used to be a broader class about like international business communication, but now it's almost all about social justice and racial justice, because I feel that that's what our Reinhardt students need to talk about, and they have so few places on campus. As was said earlier, um, they haven't been taught and given the tools, and haven't been given the space to talk about these things that they're feeling with each other, and especially across their race lines or outside of their friendship groups. And so one thing that I feel that I can contribute beyond being on social media and reposting and advocating and being an ally is in my work at Reinhardt is to try to help host, facilitate these discussions. It's not so much me spilling out my wisdom to the class, but I like to teach by just opening up um, a sense of trust, developing trust among the students, setting some guidelines, giving them the tools, and really encouraging them to speak up. And I think the most important thing that we can do now, especially those of us who are white, who have not experienced what people of color have experienced on a daily basis, is to learn to listen and to hear and to feel and to acknowledge the pain, the fear, um, all the things. I mean, following Brandy on Facebook, you know, it helps me so much. And not just Brandy, you're not the only Black person, but you're so articulate, that you stand out among my many Black friends that I follow and who I talk to, because you are so clear. And I think that the more that we can get that clarity, and the more that we who are white can hear and listen without being defensive, without talking back and saying, but if we can just listen and hear what our Black friends and other people of color, Latino and others, I have experienced, I think that's what's happened lately that's made this moment so powerful, is that I think a lot of white people have heard for the first time. And as you said, Kanika, this is a historic moment because it's a turning point. And I think that lots more white people are becoming allies and becoming more understanding and getting behind this Black Lives Matter cause.
Very good. Thank you for sharing that. And, you know, what you said kind of sparked a thought in me of, if you are someone who is a person of color and someone who never has dealt with race as a major issue comes to you and says, you know, how can I support you? How can I support the movement? What would you say? And I would like to hear from Calvin and Adam and also Nicholas Johnson there. I caught him right as he was putting something in his mouth too, so I apologize for that. But any of you guys can chime in at any time. Please don't wait on me to call upon you. You can always chime in and give your thoughts. But what would you say to that person, you know, that Dr. Wilson's even describing, who said, you know what, I didn't know. You know, what can I do moving forward? What can I do? What steps can I take?
I think it's, sorry, jumping back to what you said at first. I think you get in a situation like this where you see how reactive people are and how non-proactive people are to situations. And I think that becomes part of the problem and issue underlying, is because this conversation probably doesn't get held in general if something like this doesn't happen, which can be almost an issue in itself because we're just reacting off what we see when it comes to the media. And coming from a standpoint of being reactive, I feel like sometimes it almost becomes like a feel-good moment for people to have this conversation and feel like they played a part in being progressive when it comes to these certain things. So it's cool to have these conversations, and it's cool for people to be aware of what quotations around that, aware of what's going on and whatnot. But until you actually get out there and you start putting in actions and whatnot and reforming systems that have that cause these issues and cause these problems, protesting can only do so much, because that's for the awareness part. But you need reform, and especially when it comes to the system, in the classrooms too as well. So when you think about things like, why not teach things like African American studies? Why not have those cultural courses that Brandy was talking about? Why not do things like that and implement them into the schooling system so you can educate the person that's asking what they can do and whatnot? People in power, or really until white people get tired of things like this happening, then they're going to continue to happen, because that's the group that's in the majority right now. It's in control. So you're going to keep running into this issue, and you're going to keep running into this problem until the people in power decide to stop it. And so when you get out and you tell people to go vote and whatnot, and it's little things like that. Like, if you know how to vote, you know how to register to vote, things like that, educate somebody else on how to vote, and how to register, because we just had the primaries, and Generation Z really wasn't out there voting in the polls. So you see that happen, and it's little things like that where you can get people to be proactive, and you can teach them how to vote, how to register, what to look for when they're voting, things like that. Get them active in the community, because like you said, Dr. Wilson, that's going to be the generation that comes up next, that's going to bring a lot of the change for this country, really. So yeah, I would just say to educate people, and you can protest to bring awareness, but you also have to be understanding that you need action too as well. So the protesting and educating and having these conversations can only go so far. It's like a student in the classroom that only studies, and they're really good with the book, but they don't know how to apply it to real life. It doesn't help them at all. So you have to be aware of that.
Absolutely.
I would like to chime in if that's okay.
Yes, absolutely.
So I remember we were talking about how we have to learn how the systemic racism affects our lives and what actions and biases we exhibit that could contribute to that system of oppression. And I remember when Ms. Wilson was talking, she mentioned something saying that you were very articulate, and being raised by a woman who was told that all of her life, that, oh, you're so articulate. It kind of irks a nerve, because in our minds, it's as if, are you saying Black people are not supposed to be articulate? I just remember my mom sharing experiences where people would say that to her, and it would put an uncomfortable feeling, as if that person just told her Black people aren't supposed to be articulate, but you are. And I would really urge for that to be corrected in the future, because that it may seem like a compliment in the beginning, but when you look at the history of how we've always been told that Black people are not smart, not intelligent, that kind of irks a nerve, as if you're implying that Black people aren't supposed to be, or just aren't smart or intelligent.
Thank you.
Can I, oh, sorry, I was going to just address that. I was there, but no, go ahead, Adam, I've spoken. Oh, sorry. So I was just going to say, I think you do bring up a great point. I actually shuddered a little when I heard that, but also saw other Black people's face when it was said, but I, in that moment, chose to this is what Black people have to do all the time, right? Like, we have to make a conscious decision. Is this a battle or is this not a battle, right? And Dr. Wilson has been one of my professors. I feel like I know her heart pretty well. And so I had already determined in my mind, that'll be a side conversation that I'll have with Dr. Wilson to help her understand, I understood she meant that as a compliment, but what that means, not only for me as a Black woman, but as a Black woman who has grown up in predominantly white spaces. It is absolutely a trigger, but and I think that's the hard part too, is also when you're dealing with young, generationally, right? What's to one person seems really offensive may not necessarily seem offensive to another person regionally. I think there are differences in it too. But yes, I had the exact same reaction as you did, because my entire life I've heard, you sound like a white girl. And I'm like, I don't know what that means. Really, like, is that a positive or is that a negative? And I think it has meant different things to different people, right? I remember by the time I got to my senior year at Reinhardt, and I went to Reinhardt when it was very different demographically. I remember sort of having like almost sort of a version of a nervous breakdown, just because I was too Black for the white people and not Black enough for the Black people. And that's a hard space to be in. It actually encouraged me to sort of write my senior thesis about the internal caste system that we have in the Black community when it comes to color and colorism. And so it is a challenge, but I also, as soon as I heard Dr. Wilson say it, I was like, ooh, that's an opportunity for a learning.
Correct.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
So it's really interesting, and I really appreciate your giving me that feedback. I had never thought of that, because the point I was hoping to make is that Brandy, different from, as somebody said earlier, I can't remember, it may have even been before this officially started, rather than trying to be gentle and Southern, Brandy is honest. And that's why I was trying to point out that she stands out among all the people that I talk to as somebody who lets her anger show. She is honest about feelings, and she maybe it's because she says she's not afraid of offending people, but I appreciate that so much, because I hear things from her that I don't hear from other Black friends. That, you know, I think a lot of Southern Black people may have been taught, and probably have, I don't know, because I don't know the insides of those home lives, but may have been taught not to say things that might spark any conflict. And Brandy's not afraid of being a little conflictual. And to me, that's really refreshing and healthy. And that's what I was referring to. I wasn't trying to say that she was just well-spoken, because of course she is, but lots of other people are. But she speaks in a different way, and she calls out people, and it's very refreshing to me to hear that. And it opens my eyes in ways that other conversations don't necessarily.
I would really like to say, I appreciate what you just said, Dr. Wilson, but there is such a vast difference between what you just said in describing Brandy and being articulate. So just in terms of how, you know, language is such a funny thing, and we all get caught in not always being able to say the things the way we mean to say them. And so, but what you just described is so different from somebody who speaks well. You're talking about somebody, it was a qualitative thing about the way in which Brandy, who, yeah, you're down here, communicates. And that's not about articulation at all. That is about being honest, being clear. And I think it's important. I think that white people have a difficult time sometimes because you don't walk in our shoes, and you don't have to be thoughtful in ways that we have to be thoughtful, because we always have been taught and know that what we say could be the difference in whether or not we get to go home at night or go to the cemetery. And so so it's real important to, you know, to be really clear about what it is you're trying to communicate. And I don't mean to be picking on you, because I've said things, gosh, that were not, you know, in my head, I was thinking one thing and what came out was so different. But it is such a vast difference between someone speaks well, which is articulation, and someone speaks forcefully and courageously and out of a clear spot in their psyche, which is what you seem to be wanting us to understand about Brandy. And Brandy, I don't know you, but I appreciate that being a way that you can be characterized. But, you know, I would like to say that we're talking about this kind of thing, and this is all important, but I'm so preoccupied with the fact that we've got, but probably by the time we finish this panel, somebody else will have been killed in this country by a police officer or somebody white who thought that, or if not killed, at least had the police called on them or something. So I find myself as a 50-year veteran of working to make the place more fit for all of us to live together. very preoccupied with, let's be careful that our work actually ends up being capable of shifting the narrative in a way that might save somebody's life. So that let's make sure we get to the core of stuff. And I really appreciated what you had to say, Calvin, about what are you going to do when the protest ends? It's not actually that hard to go protest. It's, you know, I mean, there are lots of young folks out protesting, and I look at some of them and think they don't have a clue and they don't know history because we haven't taught them. And this is all going to go away because it's right now, folks are quarantined and their energy has to go somewhere. But what are we going to do when that's all gone, when everybody's gone home and the dust is settled? What is going to be the plan? And that's the thing that I'm so preoccupied with, because we do not need to end up a year from now with another George Floyd, another Breonna Taylor, so that we can all be disturbed for 3 or 4 months and then we go back to business as usual. So in response to the question of how current events affecting me, it's affected me in that I'm a little weary of the knee-jerkiness and the anxiety about what to do. The reason why we're asking that question is because we haven't been doing what we should have been doing, which is addressing this all the time as the systemic issue that it is. So I hope that if nothing else, particularly institutions, can actually decide to do something real and not just put Band-Aids on the situation, because we're so good at that, putting a Band-Aid on a sore that should have had surgery.
Right.
And I really hope that won't be the case. I mean, you are a university community and you have a captured audience and you have an opportunity to actually allow some time for the work to be done and make sure that the work around race doesn't get stuck in a 45-minute lunch period or something, which is usually what ends up happening. And then people can feel like they did something, but actually you didn't.
Well, you know, and you bring up very good points, and I'm going to ask Adam to chime in because he was so gracious in letting some other people answer. But you bring up a very good point. Do you guys think that, you know, we've had these protests for a number of weeks now. Do you think the attention has started to shift and focus more on those things that you're talking about, Dr. Meeks, so those, you know, the voting, as Calvin was talking about, those more strategic things that people need to do, so that this is not something that we're revisiting again in a couple of years, or we're, you know, another hashtag. So Adam, what are your thoughts on that? And then I saw Nicholas, he's nodding and throwing thumbs up. I'd like to get your thoughts on that too.
From the grand picture, I'm hopeful. I can definitely say within my circles, and what I mean by circles as far as colleagues, past colleagues, individuals from the graduate school I went to, the conversations we've been having, the resources that have been shared between us, going back to your original question, coming to myself or others, oh, what can I do? Or, you know, this is all new, or I didn't know this was going on. So a lot of it's going to be being uncomfortable, and a lot of brown and black individuals would probably be able to say, welcome, welcome to being uncomfortable. So it's about, okay, we don't need to always be at the forefront of those marches, of those arguments, of those conversations. And I'm inspired by seeing the individuals at the protests. It gives me hope, like you said, for the generation that I'm seeing at those, because now we have a seat at the table through them, have a seat at those conversations. But I'm hopeful within what I'm seeing, because I'm seeing continued outside of the protests, just in smaller conversations of individuals who are really having seen a lynching, basically, you know, right, on video, that it's hit them, and they're realizing it's unfortunate that it took something to that caliber for them to realize, but I see the urgency, I see the determination, I see the just the energy that they are having as far as they're wanting to learn, they're wanting to educate. And I think a lot of it, as far as like what they can do, starts with that, is that even once the dust settles, you know, the lights are off, the crowd's gone home, you know, what is that, you know, I think sports a lot, you know, it's like, what is that athlete doing when no one's watching? You know, are they putting in the work? Are they putting in the time? And it's okay, a lot of it's gonna have to start with that individual. And
Right.
whether it's back to those microaggressions of, you know, the compliments and stuff like that. And a lot of it's, you just aren't aware, maybe for your own upbringing. I can't remember who said it, but someone said that the microaggressions, such as the compliments or whatnot, it's almost thought of as like death by 1,000 cuts. You know, that many of us, you know, we continue to keep hearing that, and it's that, do I say something? Do I not? Did they mean it this way? Like Brandy was mentioning, you know, well, do I know the heart of this person? But it's that juggling act that many of us do on a day-to-day basis. You know, even growing up, we're always considered to be on as soon as we leave the house. You know, that we always feel that way, and we have always been taught to be that way because we don't know who's watching or what's being said or what's going on. So I think many of us have that, you know, that juggling act that we've been doing, but to have that conversation with yourself, even if it's whether it's the microaggressions, whether it's the I grew up in this area or my parents felt this way, exploring those unconscious biases, you know, exploring why is this uncomfortable. Start there. If this, you know, it's going to be having those conversations. Well, why is this uncomfortable to you? Maybe you need to start there and figure out where's that coming from, and you can start working outward, you know, from starting inward, you know, and it can give you a place to start and a place to, okay, I need to go educate myself on this, or I need to go involve myself over here, or I need to go, you know, check some of my friends or peers or social circles, you know, on why are they making those comments? Where are they coming from? What's their, you know, base for doing such? But it's going to be becoming uncomfortable in those settings. I think it's going to be where the work needs to happen for individuals, for all of us, but for individuals who are asking, what can I do? Okay, start from, you know, exploring your biases, exploring, you know, things that you may not have been aware of, expanding your knowledge on that, and from that, finding something that you can contribute to.
Very good.
Can I say one thing?
Sure.
I wanted to chime in and add on to what he was saying. I remember that yesterday I was listening to the speeches of these two authors with two different books coming out. One of them is called The New Jim Crow, and another one is called White Fragility. And both of those books basically go in depth as to how the generational patterns of oppression have affected the way certain people see the world. It affects the way white people see racism. It affects the way Black people see racism. And it goes in depth as to why it is so hard to break that system, and why, when there is a lot of defensiveness instead of empathy and listening about this issue, it can create more problems than it dismantles. But those are really good resources if you just want to research, you know, what is this system? Why is it here? How does it affect me as a person?
Right. Thank you for sharing. I was going to go to Nicholas too, because he's been with Judge Carlin, but then I'll follow up with you.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
I think I agree. Let me collect my thoughts. I agree with Calvin and Ms. Meeks. It's all about the education. And it's necessarily about people that are in the majority controlling the narrative in their own lives. It's not necessarily about the protest. Like you said earlier, it's extremely easy to protest. You can get out, walk outside and protest and tell people how you feel. But the biggest problem I think that we have in today's society is that people are completely okay with being comfortable. You know, for a lot of people, if it's not broke, don't fix it. If it doesn't apply to me necessarily, then why should I be concerned? And I think that's the biggest issue right now. It is about the education. Are you going to teach people about the microaggressions? I myself have allotted to a little bit more privilege than necessarily maybe somebody of darker skin and my race. Think about everybody that's on this Zoom call right now is of some form of education, regardless if you're Black or white. I mean, regardless of where you're from, you're educated. You more than likely are intelligent. You're not more than likely, you are intelligent. You speak well. And I understand that it came off as, for a lot of times that it came off as, okay, like that's really impressive. But for Black people, she's right. You know, most Black people are deemed that they speak Ebonics or like non-Negro, or that they're not taught English. the way that it's supposed to be spoken. And that's the biggest issue for a lot of people. I've grown up personally where everybody asks me, it's like, oh, you're not really Black. And I'm like, I don't really know what that means.
Right.
Right. My mom's from the North, and even my mom, she's of lighter skin color, and she's like, I will never know what you feel because I'm not your color. She could very easily, the majority of her family passes. They pass very well, and they don't see the same racism that they see unless they're with me, and then they're like, oh, she's a part of them, or she's with them. So it is about the education. It's when you get into your classrooms and somebody makes an off-color remark, are you going to sit there and allow it to happen, or are you going to say something? With your friends, are you going to sit there and allow it to happen, or are you going to say something? Black people, we have to juggle whether or not to be, for lack of a better term, an Uncle Tom or to be raw. And we don't get to be raw. It's not that easy. You don't get to say how you feel every single time. You don't get to pick the battle because a lot of people look at you as a threat.
Yeah, I think that's a very compelling thought. The fact that you have to almost leave yourself at the door. Leave your authentic self at the door. I think that's a very compelling thought. Judge Carlin, what are your thoughts here?
I was going to pull us back towards something Calvin mentioned a second ago. I don't mean to drive us away from the colorism talk that we're having here. I think it's an important talk to have.
Yes.
Absolutely. Calvin mentioned talking about how we're going to, some of the other speakers have talked about how we're going to try to educate people as things that they've not had to focus on, things that haven't been brought, that they've not had to fear for themselves the way people of a different skin tone have had to fear for themselves because of things they say or the culture that they're having to walk in every day. One thing, Calvin, you mentioned was talking about it being in the schools. And I think something, we're educators here, we're talking about trying to educate people. I would love to see Reinhardt specifically, but a lot of our colleges, we teach core curriculum in English and we teach core curriculum that looks a certain way. There's nothing to keep us from putting a cultural study, an African-American study, to force it into the core to change the defaults of what everybody's seeing. Calvin took my class at teaching for the MBA course last fall. We talked a lot about how we change the defaults to get better outcomes. And I think that if we set it up so that we are forcing people, everybody who comes through is going to touch a degree, has to have this exposure. It's not going to fix everything, but we know that you're giving that experience, you're giving that exposure to those who can move forward. Appreciate the opportunity to be here with you guys. Thank you.
Real quick, when you talk about cultural studies or African American studies too, if this is something we all should look at definitely implementing into the curriculum, but just make sure and understand that, just to be blunt about it, not to give the whitewash version of it and to actually take a deeper dive into African American studies or cultural studies, things like that. Because at this point, people know who Dr. King is, people know who Malcolm X is, people can go off just the basis of knowing the general surface level, but talk about things like Black Wall Street that's about to be coming up in society and things like that. Talk about even Madam C.J. Walker and whatnot. That's things like that. They're starting to come to light. Take the deeper dives and actually educating people deeper than the surface level of the African American and cultural studies, and then also look at who's teaching the course and can they give that perspective to teach it from an empathetic standpoint and a viewpoint that's going to educate everybody. So that would just be my 2 cents on that, on adding the course into the curriculum.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Calvin. I think it's also important to think about, even just in traditional courses, right? Like in literature courses, like who are the authors being brought to the table? And when we talk about multiculturalism, that isn't just black and white, right? Like I think all the time of how much stuff I have to continuously teach myself because I didn't see Latinx authors. I didn't see Asian authors, right? In like my English classes. So like I'm having to go back and sort of re-educate through. And so I think there are ways to implement that through all classes. And I think students want to be able to see themselves. Oftentimes it's easier to connect with material when we see some version of ourselves. And amen on Dr. King and Malcolm X. Walter and I had a side conversation about Dr. King, and I think Dr. King is great, but I think oftentimes the history we get about Dr. King is also a very whitewashed history, in the sense that people, you know, talk about him like he wasn't as radical as he actually was. And there are a lot of things that are also left out. I mean, he was a little bit of a misogynist also, like, but we don't really talk about those kind of things as much. But like, I think oftentimes we get in the discussion too that it has to be an either or approach. And I would actually make the argument it needs to be a both approach, right? Like, we need the Dr. Kings and we need the Malcolm X's, right? So, you know, as I've seen like the protests happening, am I getting out there and protesting? No, that's not how I feel like I can be the most effective. But I also understand why those young people are out there protesting, because they're like, okay, we've kneeled, we've had silent protests, we've screamed, we have asked for fair treatment. Now that we're burning some stuff down, maybe you all will pay attention. And while I don't condone violence in any way, I also understand how we got to that point. And I think the reality is we have to have a multi-pronged approach. I mean, we didn't arrive at this problem overnight, right? Like it continues to build over the years. And so we have to think about sort of what our approaches are going to be. And also the book you were talking about, White Fragility. So I do think it's a good book. But I will also say, I think it's a hard book for a lot of white people who've never had the conversation to read for the first time, because it's like, ooh, like, whoo, like that just hit me. Like I wasn't prepared. And so I do think it's a good book to read. But what I would also suggest is so White Fragility is by Robin DiAngelo. Along with that, I would also recommend reading White Rage, which is by Carol Anderson, who's a professor at Emory. I think it's really interesting to read them sort of back to back. White Fragility is from the standpoint of a white woman. White Rage is from the standpoint of a Black woman. And to see that there are a lot of similarities in what they're saying, but there are also some differences in the lens in which they're speaking. So I think that's a great place to start. And then
one-dimensional.
Right. And I always try to think about like, what are like tangible resources that can help people. So like there's a book called So You Want to Talk About Race by Ayajoma Olu. And it just breaks it down so easy, like regardless of whether you've had these conversations before or you've never had these conversations. I think like that's a great place to sort of start. But I think what I struggle with a lot is that I think sometimes for many white people, they sometimes don't necessarily see that we as Black people are like not a monolith, right? Like no group of people is a monolith. And so we have different thoughts about this. We have different approaches. Like when I talk to my 93-year-old grandmother about what's going on in the world, her response to me is, I don't understand why you get so worked up about it. Like, it's not going to change. She's like, I've lived on this earth for 93 years and it's not going to change. So like, why are you physically getting upset? But like, to me, I'm like, but we have to do something. And so I've had to like temper, right? Like she grew up in she was born in 1927, right? She has seen things that I will never seen. And she has not only had to learn how to pick her battles, but she had to teach me how to do the same, right? Like there are things that you will continuously fight for. And then you also got to remember, like, it's a marathon, right? Like it's not a sprint. And I think that's why for many white people, you'll hear from Black people now saying we're tired, like we're exhausted. And I just think that's where a lot of folks are. And I do think what's hard for many white people right now is that like they want to, now that folks are waking up, it's like, okay, I want to be an ally. Like, tell me, like literally right now, and trust me, this is not because I'm popular. I currently have 158 text messages on my phone right now. About 100 of them are from like white people who are like, I just want to tell, like white people I haven't talked to in years, just like, I just want to tell you, like, I'm trying, like, I love you, like, I see you. And like, in one sense, that's great. Like I'm excited that they're waking up, but what's more important for me is like, what action are you taking in your communities? Because you have a privilege that I don't have. And so sort of like what Nicholas was saying, like we all have the privilege of being educated. One thing I have to do often is check myself when I'm talking to my family. Sometimes I'm talking to parents who like they didn't go to college. So sometimes I'm just spitting out language and like I look within those first few seconds, they have no idea what I'm talking about because they didn't go through the college process. And then I have to check my privilege and be like, all right, back it up, Brandy. Like this is a completely different process. And so I tell them like, if I'm throwing out terms, you don't understand what they mean, or you have questions about them, like that's fine. Like not everybody knows what the FAFSA is, like, right? Like we know we need money, but we don't know what the FAFSA is. And so I think oftentimes when we talk about white privilege, I think for many white people that feels like such a sting because they're like, I grew up poor, I didn't have privilege. The reality is we all have privilege in different ways. It may not be white privilege, but it's about taking that privilege that we have and using it to help people who don't have that same privilege, right? And I think the more of that we can do, the more helpful. Our ROTC person at school gave a really good example because in cultural fluency, people are like, I just want to be a better ally. And the word ally is thrown around a lot. And I made the comment, I'm not as interested in allies as I'm interested in accomplices, because accomplices assume some level of risk, right? An accomplice is the person who in a staff meeting, when someone says a microaggression or says something racist, they are the one who calls it out as opposed to me, because if I call it out, I could potentially be out of a job. Whereas if they call it out, nothing, chances are, will happen to them. And so our ROTC person said that, you know, white people need to understand that while we're excited that people want to be allies, there has to be a foundation level of trust that has to be established. He says, you know, he's like, when we go to war, he goes, in the US, and we have allies who are with us on the battlefield, to a certain extent, we trust them because we know we have similar interests, but it could be that the US has a much greater interest than the other country does as an ally. And so you're kind of like looking at them a little bit of like, I'm not really sure. And so like, it takes time to build that. And like history teaches us as Black people that we shouldn't automatically trust white people just out the gate, like for a variety of reasons. And so I think, you know, there's a certain level of grace that everyone has to sort of have with each other, and a certain level of grace that white people have to understand. We're coming to it and we want your help, but like, it's probably not going to happen overnight. And then also grace that we have to have with ourselves as Black people of like, we can't always be the teachers, nor should we be the teachers all the time. There are times where we are happy to help, but Google is also free. As Black people, you know, we don't get a manual on like how to navigate a white world or systems that were not created for you. We have to sort of figure it out. It's something sent down from generation to generation. And so know that like, you may get times where you may feel like you're hitting a wall with people of color, but like what shows us that we can trust you is you keep showing up, no matter how difficult it is, no matter whether we hit a nerve or not, you keep showing up and you keep trying to do the work. And I think that is how trust can be built.
So you've brought up a lot of good points, Brandy. No, and that's in a good way. And I want to go back to something that you said earlier, because I feel like during this time, we're hearing a lot of key words that are coming up, and people may not really, they have different responses to them, like you said. White privilege. On this call, for example, we've thrown up systemic racism. So I want to know what people think about when they hear the terms white privilege. What comes to your mind when you hear those terms? What comes to mind when you hear systemic racism, and what does that mean to you? And this is open for everyone.
I think the easiest way to having a white mother, it adds a different perspective into things sometimes. So even having that conversation with her can be difficult. But talking about systemic racism, you can look at things like redlining. You can look at other things that have a socioeconomic impact on Black families and whatnot. And even things that aren't taught. So, and going back to like, we're talking about education and whatnot, things like financial literacy aren't taught. Things like how to own real estate aren't taught. Things like credit aren't taught. Things that oftentimes in the Black community is not taught in the school system. And as somebody that's looking at getting financial courses implemented into the schooling system, when I asked teachers about it and whatnot, they said the reason that these courses aren't in the school system is because they expect the families to teach their kids. And the problem is, if you never teach the parent can't teach the kid. So then it becomes an evolving door of something that doesn't get fixed. So the system, when people say systemic racism, it's very real in the sense of it's historical, and it's so historical. Even things like redlining, you keep people in the same communities. And the Fair Housing Administration at one point ruled that if it was unruly for two races to live in the same community, that they can be denied the right to live there. So that's something that's had an everlasting effect on it, because then that goes back to schooling systems and how some schooling systems aren't funded because of the communities that they lived in and whatnot, to when you have Black schools that weren't funded the same way as white schools are. And if you look at those schools now, you're running into the same problem. So a lot of that comes down to the education, and the education that Black people weren't afforded. And then when you are taught the education and whatnot, it's taught from the white perspective, because that's the group that's in power. It's the easiest way, if someone doesn't understand privilege and whatnot, for me to explain to somebody would be the fact that you're able to speak English. So your language was never stripped of you. So that would be the easiest way, I think, to explain white privilege, and also to take a step back and don't think about it from an individual level, because this is not a personal attack on you, and no one's getting mad that you're white and you have that privilege. It's just more so address it, own it, and understand that you do have that privilege, and that with that privilege, you have power to do certain things, and you have power to bring progress and to bring change and whatnot. And that's okay. No one's mad at you for that. Like, think of it from a group standpoint, not attacking your individual person, but understand that as a group and as a collective unit, that white people do have privilege. So that's just my general synopsis on it.
I would like to say that I love what Ta-Nehisi Coates has to say about this subject in Between the World and Me, or You. I always can't remember the title, the pronoun in that title.
It's me.
That white privilege is actually the child of white supremacy. That the issue in this country is not so much privilege as it is the understanding that white skin is supreme to all other skin. And then all of these perks that come from whiteness have been labeled under the rubric of privilege. But the issue is, no matter how poor you are or whatever, if your skin is white, you are considered to be a different person, a different level of human being in the United States. And I think that when you think about the systems that have been developed, the systems that we have, every system in this country was developed, predicated upon that understanding that white skin is supreme, and they were put in place to benefit white people. And all of that is a kind of evolution of the mentality that made slavery possible. So when we start thinking about this in terms of looking at the whole historical narrative, we get some sense of what we're really up against in terms of trying to destabilize the systems, because there is still a great adherence to the understanding of the supremacy of white skin. And when I use the word supremacy, I am not talking about somebody in a sheet. I'm talking about the notion that just because your skin is white, it makes you better than. And that is in the DNA of every white person in ways that's so difficult to transcend. I think it's someone said, if you ask a white person to talk about whiteness and talk about supremacy, it's like asking a fish to talk about water. It's difficult to do, because it's been the reality of your life since day one that the world belongs to you, that your skin's white, that even if people didn't come right out overtly and say all of that to you, it was in the air, it was in the water, it was everywhere, and it still is. And to this moment, we have a real difficult time trying to navigate that narrative that's just so embedded and really requires white people who want to be liberated to do some extensive inner exploration and excavation about how they see the world and how they want to be in the world. And even progressive white people And there are a lot of them. I imagine that most of you on this call consider yourselves progressive, but even progressive white people can get to a point where they hit that rock of not being able to just be okay with everybody being equal and everybody being seen as equal and everybody having equal power. So I spend a lot of time trying to understand what is it really gonna take to destabilize this system that we have in place, to really create a world where there's a willingness to let everybody have equality. Because every time we take a few steps in that direction, we take great leaps to go backwards.
Right.
I never thought that we would be fighting about voter suppression in 2021, but that is a profound statement of white supremacy not wanting to see equality, because if you can mess with the voting, you can control the power and you can keep the structures that you want to keep in place. So, and I think our education systems our colleges particularly, need to get a whole lot more committed to finding ways to undermine that narrative. And I love what you said earlier, Brandy, about the possibility. It's great I'm an African American studies professor, part of what I've done, but you don't have to have African American studies in a school to have people understand that Black and Brown and Native Indigenous people live here and should be a part of life. You can almost in every discipline include those folks in what you're doing if your heart's turned in that direction. So people don't have to wait until there's an African American studies or a cultural studies program. I don't care what you're teaching, you can find people of color somewhere in that discipline that could be brought into that study if you choose to do that. And I think that I think African American studies is great and we should have it, but I think you don't need to wait until you put that into the curriculum, because I know how slow and how long it takes to get things into college curriculums. So while you're waiting on that to happen, you can rewrite your courses and you can decide, how do you make this course inclusive? And it doesn't even have to be that your course becomes a course just about race. Your course becomes a course that reflects all the people who live in this country. And that in itself may be a bigger statement than even if you try to have a conversation about race. So I think that the intention to really destabilize the systemic racism is an important thing for white people to really reflect upon. How much do I want to turn myself to this discussion and onto this pathway? And until people do that more, we're going to keep on having the systems that we've got.
And I would like to
before you get into that, Judah, I want to just make a note that we are about 20 minutes left remaining for the call. I want to encourage people, because I think we have about 13 people who are not on video. I want to encourage people to also, you can make your voice known and ask questions via the chat. I had someone, while Dr. Meeks was talking, give a thumbs up to your comment about voter suppression. They said that they're having that very situation in their race, something that our grandparents were dealing with back in the 60s. So I encourage anyone who's on the call just to, ask any question, and you will see how the panel discusses it. But go ahead, Judah. I just wanted to make that note.
Okay, and on that note, I will try to make this as fast as possible.
Oh, no.
But I wanted to piggyback off of how when we talk about systemic racism and white privilege, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're talking about a certain specific white person. I mean, sometimes we might be, but most of the time it's not. It's talking about not just white people alive today, but white people throughout history, and how all of this always translates back to slavery and the age of the African slave trade. And it did kind of pose a question, not specifically charged at anyone in particular, like I said before, but just like as a whole, who gave someone the right to declare themselves supreme over another group of people simply because of a physical trait they had that group of people did not? And it just kind of made me think, what caused those people back then to think that just all of a sudden, oh, my skin is white, so I'm supreme over you and you can't do anything about it. And when you really think about that, when you really simplify it down to those terms, as to what is at the root of all of this, it kind of helps you think with a new perspective, with a new mind on this whole issue. And it also creates a sense of empathy, because if you notice, everyone is so polarized today and there's no empathy for anyone. And when you just really start to break it down to those bare questions, it can really help you see experiences and see life from someone else's point of view.
Yeah. I completely agree. I think one thing that Dr. Meeks also said that I think is really important is, as we think about systematic racism, we think about all of the structures that are in place, everything, right? From like education to our prison systems. I was actually walking around my school and thinking about like, wow, the construction of even just the physical building we're in is the same blueprint for what a prison would be, right? So when you treat children like they're in a prison and they act like caged animals and you wonder why, like if you really sit and think about it, like those are things that people wouldn't necessarily think about. But I thought about it, I was like, wow, like you walk into our school, the first place you see is the city police department before you even get to the main office. Luckily, we have moved that, but that is sending a very intentional message without people always realizing that they're doing it. But when I think of sort of like white privilege, I think of white privilege as sometimes the smaller things that you just never have to see because they don't affect you. So for me, when I think of white privilege, I think of being able to go to what I consider my happy place, Target, and as a Black woman, go into the hair aisle and only seeing a small strip of hair products for me, whereas there's this long aisle for everyone else, right? Like that is how, that is sort of the ways in which white privilege shows up. Or, you know, the way that I can, I was thinking about this the other day. I used to, on the back of my car, have like my Reinhardt sticker and all the places that I have worked in admissions, which are all college admissions offices. And I thought, like, as I got a new car, I didn't put the stickers on the car. And I thought to myself the other day, gosh, I need to put the stickers back on my car, not because I wanted people to know necessarily that I was associated with those schools, but I wanted to put those stickers on my car so that if I got pulled over by the police would at least know that I was educated in some way, and maybe, just maybe, that might prevent me from being killed. And like, white privilege is having to never think about that, having to never think about where you move your family, never having to think about like if that community is going to have a hair salon. I mean, you know, like I can just be honest and say it took me turning 40 years old for me to finally feel like I could be in a professional setting and wear my natural hair. Like that's some deep-seated crap, y'all. Like, but those are the messages that we are sent, right? Like, I think somebody talked about this earlier, like the idea of code switching and being intentional about every email, the tone, how you talk to people. Like I code switch so much on a daily basis, I don't even notice it. Like I actually have a t-shirt that says "Too tired to code switch." So my kids, like at school, when I wear that t-shirt, they're like, oh yeah, she's not here for the foolishness, not today. And so those are the kind of things that I think sometimes, like when we talk about white privilege, those are the things that people don't understand. But I think it's also important for people to understand, and I can speak for me, I never try to speak for like all Black people, but like for me, my pro-Blackness does not mean that I'm anti-white. It means I love my people, I love my culture. It doesn't mean that I'm anti-white. Like 2 of my best friends from high school are white, which then, like, as I say that, I hate when people are like, but I have a Black friend. I'm like, okay, great. But you know, like, I think I think there's always this assumption that if you are pro-Black or if you like care a lot about your culture, you somehow hate white people. I don't. Like, I'm always amazed when people want to have discussions about diversity and don't include white people. So I used to actually coordinate multicultural recruitment at Vanderbilt, and we would have an overnight program for multicultural students. And I would say, I feel like we're building a false narrative for these kids. We're inviting them here for the weekend. It's 200 students of color. They're here surrounded by those students of color all weekend, but that's not going to be realistic when they come here in the fall. Oftentimes they're going to be one of the few in their classroom. And so I was like, we need to start inviting white people to the conversation. And that apparently was super controversial because people were like, well, no, like they're taking up space. And in one sense, I get that. But in another sense, like, what message are we sending to kids if we're telling them it's this super diverse place, and then they get in the classroom and then they're feeling like we sold them a right, a bill of rights? Like, that's not, okay. And then last thing, I was just thinking back to Mr. Terrence's comment. You talked about how you have sort of the most privilege here, and you just want to sort of listen. Going back to what Dr. Meek said, I would actually say the people that I've had the most challenging conversations when it comes to race are not straight white men. The two groups that I've had the biggest struggle in having conversations with are members of the LGBTQ community who are white, and white women. And I'll give just some quick examples of how that works. So I had a colleague who is a white gay man, and he very much felt that the LGBT rights movement and the racial equality movement were equal. And I was like, well, first of all, I'm not really interested in playing the oppression Olympics. Like, it sucks for both of us. So let's just acknowledge that. But he was like, when I try to fight, and this was before same-sex marriage was legal, he's like, when I fight for that and people don't listen, I need you to understand this is my Montgomery bus boycott. And I was like, I have to actually stop you there, because what I need you to understand is, when people see you, they see your whiteness first. People don't actually know your sexual orientation until you disclose that information to them. For me as a Black woman, like, this never comes off. Like, before I even open up my mouth, assumptions have been made. People have thoughts about who I am, what I bring to the table. And so I think that's important to know. I think there's still lots of conversations that need to have between, like, the Black community and the LGBT community, because there are a lot of issues there as well. But then also with white women, like, sometimes I think to myself, like, man, like, I could probably create a pool of the white female tears that I have been surrounded by throughout my lifetime. Because for many white women, I think sometimes they don't understand, sometimes they are the greatest upholders of white supremacy, and that when they don't know what to do or they feel backed in a corner, their immediate instinct is to sort of let the tears roll. And I think, and that's not for all, like, I'm not trying to make generalizations, but I think for many, and I think the challenging part about that is, for many white women, they don't understand when they weaponize their tears in that way. Plenty of Black people in this country have died because of the weaponizing of white female tears. I'm a big fan of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery and the work of Brian Stevenson. And when you go to the memorial outside and you walk sort of down the pathway, on the walls, you'll see different descriptions of why this lynching happened and why this lynching happened. And the first 17 to 20 that you see are because of white women's tears or the words of white women. And so to me, that means that white women have a greater responsibility, because they have more power oftentimes than they realize. And I think sometimes white women don't see that, but then I point right back to the feminism movement. Women of color started the feminism movement, but white women generally get the credit for the feminism movement. Like, that is privilege and power. And so I think the reality is no matter how you step into the conversation, like, none of us can apologize for what we didn't ask for, right? None of us asked to be a certain race or a certain gender or a certain sexual orientation, but each of us in some way brings a privilege, and we just got to use that privilege to help those that don't have the same one.
Right.
I'm gonna shut up now.
No, it's okay, Brandy. One of the things that came to mind when you were giving those examples was that situation with Amy Cooper in New York, right? And I think that's a perfect example of what you were talking about there, just an exercise of power that people just don't understand. But we had an opportunity to see that walked out. We had an opportunity to see that strategy where I'm calling someone, okay? And so that's a perfect example of what you were just talking about.
And the white, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Calvin.
I was gonna say, Dr. May, you had a question in the chat box. After hearing such a refreshing conversation, what ideas do you and the Student Affairs Department have to incorporate a more diverse and inclusive curriculum? More or in what ways can current students, especially those of color, expect growth from this conversation? I just want to make sure that was addressed before we got off the call.
Yeah, I was just reading that. Thank y'all for that question, Dwayne.
Thanks, Calvin.
I think that, one of the things that we're going to look at, one, this is going to be an ongoing conversation through the rest of the semester, but also Lydia and I, who are putting together the first year seminar course, are actually going back through the curriculum this summer. We're looking at every article, every reading, every activity, and building that out. That's all. The first year seminar course is the largest course on campus. It actually has 350 students, and we can have an impact. And so we're going to look at how that course is actually, we're shifting it a little bit this summer. And what we're looking at is a call to action. And one of the things we're going to develop in that course is the curriculum, looking at the readings, the assignments, who's being represented, who's not being represented. And so we're going to be touching on that throughout the course. And we're really going to be, and actually part of the service learning project, we had been the last year or so working on financial literacy. We're switching it to an assignment. It's actually a call to action assignment. And it's a service learning project that our students will be working on. I think for us, I know I can help, as Dean of Students, I can help manage that piece of the curriculum. One thing is on the cabinet and working on the Provost Council, Dr. Chair and I can be advocates for looking at that curriculum. How, long-term, what is our goal? How can we improve that? In student affairs, I'm putting together with my colleagues a Black student task group that will look at the experience of Black students on our campus from past to present. How do we improve that experience? How do we better advocate? What are our policies? Looking at public safety, looking at housing, looking at dining services, looking at athletics. How does it, all those different aspects of that student experience, how do we improve it? What are we hearing from students and things, and how can we can really look at how do we change the institution, our structural and systemic ways. And so all those different elements are going to be open to moving forward. How do we change? How do we evolve this institution to better serve and better advocate and better have a better experience for our students of color? And how do we position all our students to be advocates, to be engaged citizens in our country, to be engaged not only on our campus and not to be passive bumps on a log, and hear it, but how do we push them and educate them so they can be a voice, not just an ally, but a co-conspirator. I really like that. How do we move that pendulum forward? How do we move our students and our community forward? Reinhardt really, I've been at Reinhardt almost 20 years. We've never had a conversation like this in my time. And so I'm hoping, using this platform and moving forward. And how do we move forward together as a greater community?
I would ask a question about staffing.
Mm-hmm.
What about staffing? What is the demographics of the staff?
I would say majority white, almost overwhelming majority. One thing that I'm hoping as we move forward, in student affairs, we have a number of positions open. And my goal is, how do we advertise? How do we reach? How do we create a orientation and a experience for those people of color who want to come to Reinhardt and have that better experience so they'll stay? And so those are all things that I'm looking at in student affairs. I know there are open positions across the board. And so that's definitely a big piece of it.
This is not a shot to anybody, but with all due respect, there's been plenty of opportunities for people of color to assume positions within the community, and then you step back and you look at the credentials of the people that were hired instead of the people that weren't hired, and the only thing that sometimes you can go back to is that they didn't receive that position because of the color of their skin. So when it comes to who's selecting the people that take these roles and that accept these positions, because student affairs and whatnot, nice. Like I said, people of color have been more than for the role that haven't received it. So in what way, shape, or form would you go about making sure that people that select who gets these roles is an all-inclusive group and not just from one group standpoint, if that makes sense?
You broke up a little bit. I couldn't
Does
hear
Calvin,
part of that.
can I interject really quickly because I want to give you guys time. We have about 3 minutes left for the session, and I don't want Zoom to cut us off. But we have 3 minutes. So Dr. May, if you want to answer that, and then we can come to a close. And knowing that this is just the beginning, this is just the first conversation of many that Reinhardt has planned. So Dr. May, go ahead.
I think it's definitely looking at looking at these positions. I know we have a career services position. We have 2 public safety positions open. We have a campus ministry position open right now. We have a residence life position that we're hoping to fill. And so one of my things is how do we recruit and create an experience to recruit to get that sustainable? We've actually over the last 5 years had a number of staff members of color, but they didn't stay very long. And so I want to look at how do we make that a better experience so they will stay.
Very good. Very good. Thank you all for that. I'm looking into 2 more minutes, and I actually wanted to ask one last question about where we should be focused on now. And I'm looking around. I'd like to hear from Judge Carlin, excuse me, and Calvin, and also Dr. Meeks. If you could just if you could take us home and answer that question. What should we be focused on now, individually?
I'll just say really quickly, I think that people really need to spend a lot of time paying attention to your own thoughts and feelings and the projections that you make onto other people and asking yourselves why. And I would recommend Debbie Irvin's book, Waking Up White and Finding Myself in the Story of Race, as a book that white people who are kind of needing to begin that kind of process might find helpful.
Thank you. Judge Carlin?
Yes, I think that we talked a lot about microaggressions today. In the white community, you have people that feel very comfortable saying things when folks who all look white are standing around. Our opportunity here for those of us on the call is to stand up and don't let that pass. And that's something that's easy sometimes to let go and think, oh, they don't really mean that, or this is a group of people who really feel that way. Maybe I need to just keep my mouth shut. We've got to start stepping up, finding those opportunities to say, hey, we're not going to let that go. Like, explain yourself. Say that again. Would you say that if somebody else was standing here? And call them out, because that supremacy is fragile. And if you poke it, it hopefully will fall down like that house of cards that it is, because it doesn't have any actual weight to it. And if it doesn't, then you've exposed somebody for what they are. And so push that. Including, we've had a lot of really great resources that have been mentioned here. I want to continue to do that. If you're on this call and you didn't know one of those resources, or you don't have a book or an article or an interview that you can tell somebody today, if they asked you for how to be a better ally, co-conspirator, whatever it may be, if you don't know one of those off the top of your head, educate yourself in the next month and find one. A lot of them have been kicked out here. I think we should definitely talk about those more.
Thank you very much. And Calvin, I'll wrap up with you.
Be proactive about the situation. Look at your board of trustees and the professors in the classroom who actually teach the students. And then also too, if you say that you're going to provide progress and whatnot, to actually stand on it. And months down the road, don't have the same conversation talking about, well, we're still working on a plan, or have these great ideas or these answers that almost, sorry to be blunt, that almost seem recited in some points, just to appease somebody. Not trying to be aggressive or anything like that, but that's just how I feel about the situation. So when you come back to the conversation months later and you continue to have these conversations, make sure that you're actually having action and it's not just sweet words and sweet talk to appease a group and put a pacifier in somebody's mouth.
Well, thank you all so much. This has been a wonderful discussion. We're going to bring it to a close tonight. I know you guys have dedicated your evening, your Monday evening to this, and I want to thank you. And those who are non-video participants, thank you for joining in as well. Again, we're going to have continued conversation. I think our next one is next month, Dr. May. And so we are looking forward to everyone bringing their unique perspectives as we continue to have these much needed conversations and move forward into action. So thank you all very much for your time tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Very beneficial.
Good night.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
Have a great night. Everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.